introduction to philosophy. And I want to tell you that philosophy is one of the most important and critical disciplines in the formulation of a theological student. Now, let's begin from the origin, from the onset. Philosophy from its etymology. Etymology is the root word, from the root word or the origin of philosophy. Pythagoras is said to be the first person to call this discipline philosophy. And philosophy is derived from two Greek words, philos and logos. Philos means love, and logos and Sophia, sorry, it is philos and Sophia. Philos means love. Sophia is wisdom. Therefore, philosophy in a nutshell is the love of wisdom. As we continue to describe philosophy, philosophy is an inquiry that entails, interpretation, analysis,
criticism,
speculation, and criticism. These are four critical elements in philosophy. We analyze, we criticize, we speculate, and we do analysis. That is philosophy. And I want to tell you, philosophy entails discussion of everything under the sun. Any subject matter under the sun can be a legitimate study of philosophy, be it geography. When people get PhD, Doctor of Philosophy, it is either PhD in mathematics, PhD in geography, PhD in chemistry. Therefore, any study under the sun is within the ambit of philosophy. Therefore, it is critical that you understand that in philosophy we discuss a broad spectrum of events and a broad spectrum of issues. Those are called philosophical issues. And I want to look at the five distinct branches of philosophy. How many of you can remember the five branches of philosophy that we discussed in class? Very good. Number one is metaphysics. Beyond the physical. We deal with questions of does God exist? Do we have a free will? It discusses being and reality. What is real? That is one branch of philosophy. The branch is called metaphysics. The second branch of philosophy is not called metaphysics. The second branch is called epistemology. Epistemology is the study of knowledge, its limitation, and the use of knowledge. And just as I told you, there are two forms of knowledge. There is what we call a priori knowledge. A priori knowledge is the knowledge that you get without experience. The knowledge that 1 + 1 is equals to 2 is called a priori knowledge. And the other one is called a posteriori knowledge. A posteriori knowledge is knowledge after experience. That is a priori knowledge. When you find people like Plato, Plato emphasized the a posteriori knowledge. It's knowledge before, no, a priori knowledge. He emphasized a priori knowledge without experience. But Aristotle emphasized on knowledge after experience, which is called a posteriori knowledge. Therefore, you can understand this has been the two distinction of knowledge. Do we understand everything? Knowledge. Are we confident of the knowledge that we have? Is it knowledge after experience, or is it knowledge before experience? Which knowledge can be trusted with certainty? That is the second branch of philosophy. The third branch of philosophy is the branch that is called ethics. Ethics is the study of the right and the wrong. It's the study of ethos, values of communities, values of a particular society. There are people who believe that they are objective ethics, ethics that apply to everybody. They are called objective ethics. What is wrong for everyone. Like when somebody says stealing is wrong for everyone, that is objective ethics. There are ethics that are called relative ethics. It's ethics based on particular community. Like the Maasai community, it says that people of the same age sex, the same age set, can engage with sex of their fellow wives. It was a method of bonding within the age set, so long as you plant your spear in the door so that somebody can know that people are here and he can go to another place. That is what we call relative ethics, ethics that is relative. In most of the African communities, stealing is not wrong when you steal from another community. But when you steal from your own community, that is when it is considered as wrong. That is what we call relative ethics. There is also people who consider an ethic that is called subjective ethics. Ethics based on personal taste, preferences, and choices. They say that the people who support homosexuality support it based on subjective ethics, that there are no objective standard. It's your choice. And people who support abortion, they say abortion can be supported from pro-choice. You can determine whether the creature living in you can inhibit your rights and you do away with it. But I want to believe that there are things that belong to the relative, to the objective ethics, like killing. You cannot kill just for the sake of killing and say it's based on your subjectivity. You are killing an enemy. It's wrong. There are things that are relative based on particular community. Like there are people who walk scantily dressed. They only cover below their belt because they live in very hot environment. And that is their norm and their ethics. There are things that are dependent on individuals. And I wanted to mention something on ethics. We also talk about bioethics. We talk about issues of euthanasia, mercy killing, and active and passive euthanasia. Active mercy killing and passive. Passive is like when you remove the life supporting machine. It's called passive euthanasia. Active euthanasia is when you support someone to kill himself. You take a gun and ensure that you shoot someone who is terminally ill. He cannot recover and is in deep pain. That is called active euthanasia. There are issues like cloning. These are issues that belong to the ambit of ethics, and we discuss them as philosophers. The other branch of philosophy is aesthetics. Aesthetics is the sentiments of beauty, the study of beauty, and the expression of the language of beauty. Some people say beauty is to the beholder. Some people think that small is beautiful. Some think that big is better. But all of them are within the ambit of philosophy. Something that we call it aesthetics, the study of beauty. There is logic. Logic is a branch of philosophy, and it deals with correct thinking. It's called correct thinking. There are arguments in logic that are called sound arguments and arguments that are not sound argument. Those are what we call the formal fallacies. They are best when you have a sound argument is when the premises support the conclusion. You can have an argument is that all men are rational. Cleophas is a man. Therefore, Cleophas is a rational being or a rational animal. That is good reasoning. That's a sound argument because the premise support the conclusion. But you say, Cleophas is a man. All men are rational. Cleophas is a man. Therefore, Cleophas is irrational. That is unsound argument because the conclusion does not support the main argument. And I want to tell you very categorically that those are when you have an unsound argument, it's called a formal fallacy. But there are informal fallacies. Informal fallacies are where the context and the content of the argument cannot be logically verifiable. It cannot be sustained by reasoning and rational scrutiny and examination. Some of the informal fallacies where the content and the main argument are not followed exhaustively. Some of the informal fallacies, like fallacy ad hominem. Fallacy ad hominem is a fallacy where you appeal to emotions and you attack the person and not the argument. You can say Jesus is wrong because he's a sabot, but you have not attacked my argument. It is a fallacy. Some of the fallacies to appeal on sympathy, like mimi hapa mumenikataa kwa sababu mimi nateseka ama mimi ni maskini. You are not defending your argument, you are appealing to sympathy. It's called a fallacy. And those are the 5 branches of philosophy that you must never ever forget. You must never ever forget the 5 branches of philosophy. There are methods of doing philosophy. Some of the methods of doing philosophy. The first method is called the dogmatic. The first method is called the dogmatic method. The dogmatic method of doing philosophy is a method where you take certain things as being axiomatic and true. You take certain argument as true. You assume them to be true without defending them. It is one of the arguments is one of the methods of doing philosophy. It's called dogmatic philosophy. The dogmatic method of doing philosophy. Some of it is the empirical method of doing philosophy, where you use the 5 common senses and you examine things empirically. What cannot be supported with the 5 common senses of taste, smell, seeing, hearing, and touching. Those are the things that you neglect. It's one of the methods. The other one is the skeptical method. You begin with a doubt, and you doubt anything that cannot be empirically verifiable. People like David Hume use that method of doing philosophy. In a nutshell, those are the few methods of doing philosophy. Now, let's go to the history of philosophy. The history of philosophy comes from Greek and the Greek nation. It came sometimes around 500 years before Christ. And we begin with a session of people who are called the pre-Socrates philosopher. The pre-Socrates philosopher were the successors of the poets and the theologists who were philosophers who explain the existence of the universe based on the following. They explain the existence of the universe based on the following. Number 1, based on the origin being God. They had myths to explain the origin of the world. But the pre-Socrates philosophers had a new understanding. The new understanding is called, they had a scientific way of looking at things. And they sought to explain the subject matter of the existence of the world based on scientific method. And one of the methods that they based is explaining the world based on things that were scientifically there. The first of these philosophers, where they dealt with cosmology. Cosmology is the study of the origin of the universe. So one of the first philosophers was a man by the name of Thales. Thales was a philosopher who thought that the primordial stuff that explains the existence of the world is what we call water. Why did he discover water as the primordial stuff? Because water could be found in three states. Water is solid, water can be liquid, and water is gas. Therefore, according to him, everything came from water. And according to Thales, water was the primordial stuff, and water was everything. That could explain everything in the universe. He did not seek to explain it in terms of myth, but he explained it in terms of water. And according to him, Thales was also a mathematician. He was able to calculate the length of a tree based on its shadow, and also the length of a pyramid. He was able to calculate the distance of the sea in the ship, or the distance of the ship in the sea, by calculating and observing how the ship moved from one point to the other. So he was a great mathematician. And also another thing that about Thales is that he predicted the eclipse of the moon that happened in 585 BC. So far, we have looked at this philosopher by the name of Thales. And according to Aristotle, he picked water because even food is always most as we eat it. Therefore, water will explain everything. Number two, when we look at Thales, we go to a philosopher by the name of Anaximander. Anaximander, according to Anaximander, the primordial stuff was the undifferentiated mass. The undifferentiated mass from which particular things were made. From this one undifferentiated mass, we got particular things. But it is not from the particular things that we get this undifferentiated mass. From this undifferentiated mass, which is the primordial stuff, which is the source of everything, from it we get the particular things that we have, like grass, like wood. Everything came from the original stuff. And according to him, the earth was like a disk floating in water. He had the germ of understanding gravity. And he said the world was full of water. Then after some time, the water dried. And the animals that were able to survive on dry land survived, and those that were not able died. That was the origin of natural selection and the origin of the scientific thinking of evolution. Scientific thinking of evolution. The other philosopher was Anaximenes. According to Anaximenes, the primordial stuff is air. And he came to this conclusion because when he looked at the living creatures, according to him, what the living creature needs more is what? Air. You remember during the COVID pandemic, 2020, people without oxygen, what happened to them? If you could not inhale oxygen, what happened?
Died.
You died. And it became a big threat when you lack oxygen. And there are two things about air. There is what we call condensation and rarefaction. From air, there was when it condensed, it formed earth, it formed rocks when it condensed. But when there was rarefaction, it formed fire. So according to him, the primordial stuff is air. Now we go to a man by the name of Heraclitus. Heraclitus, when he observed everything, everything was in a constant flux and change was real. It says it is only the senses that makes us to think that things are permanent. But everything is coming and becoming. Even our bloodstream, they change. Therefore, everything is in the process of changing. And change is very, very real. So according to him, what signifies and symbolizes change, that is the reality of life, is fire. Fire was an emblem of change. And there was condensation and rarefaction. For when fire expands, it lights. Then when fire contracts, it condenses. So everything comes from fire, and everything will go to fire. So fire is what is the reality of life. He said you cannot jump into the river twice. Everything is changing and becoming. The last philosopher that we look at this particular moment is someone by the name of Parmenides. According to Parmenides, the being, the unchangeable being, the being is, the unchanging being is the primordial stuff. The being who is unchangeable is the primordial stuff. And according to him, it is senses that cheats us that everything is changing. But in reality, everything is permanent. Even an arrow, as you throw it, the arrow remains in the same spot. It is only you are deluded or cheated that the arrow is moving. Everything is the same. Even if you run, you are still the same. Where are you running to? You are remaining in the same position. It's only the senses that cheat you, that you are changing and you are moving. Those are the philosophers that I will call the pre-Socrates philosophers. They are very critical in our learning of philosophy. Why? Because they introduced the scientific thinking. And the gem of most of the scientific thinking came from the pre-Socrates philosophers. Now we come to the great era of philosophy. And in the great era of philosophy, we look at philosophers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Socrates was a philosopher that never wrote anything. He never wrote anything. Hakuandika kitabu. He never engaged in any discussion. He did not do lectures, but he engaged in debates, a series of debates. And I want to say that dialogue was very critical. His methods was dialogical and dialectical. He created two opposing ideas, and finally there was a thesis and antithesis and a synthesis. He questioned the people. In Socrates, we learned what we call the Socratic problem. The Socratic problem is that he never wrote anything. So a lot of things that we learn from him are from his students, like Plato and Aristophanes. So if people quote from you, like you students, you can quote from Jesus. Is everything that you quote from me the truth?
No.
Some things you may attribute that I said, but I did not say. That is what we call the Socratic problem. But there is what we call the Socratic irony. The thing that happened is that Socrates said, the only thing I know is that I don't know anything. His mother was a midwife. He did not give people the truth. But as a midwife, he used to be a philosophical midwife. He helped people to discover truth on their own. He was very humble. The Socratic irony was that Socrates claimed to not know. But the people who claimed to know did not know anything. That is the irony. The one who claimed not to know, Socrates, knew. But the people who claimed to know did not know. That's what we call the Socratic irony. The conscience was very important to Socrates because according to him, the conscience was the voice of God. That's why he could not run. Socrates was accused of defiling the morals of the young people and introducing strange gods. Greek society was polytheistic. There were many gods. But Socrates introduced the concept of one God, theism, the concept of one God, mono, monotheism, one God. And he was accused, and they voted. He had a chance to flee, but because he believed that the conscience was very critical, he did not flee, and he took his death with courage and took hemlock as poison. So we learn a lot of things about Socrates. We learn about his method. We learn of his method that he taught by asking questions. Some people think that a philosopher is someone who asks many questions. You will discover that in my class, I ask many questions. And by asking many questions, we learn. And that is philosophy. The other great philosopher is a person by the name of Plato. Plato was a great philosopher. He was a musician. He was an expert in geometry. Plato was a wrestler. In fact, the name Plato was a nickname, meaning a man with broad shoulders. Plato was a man to establish an all-embracing system of philosophy, an all-embracing system of philosophy. And it's based on his theory of forms and ideas. According to him, what is real is in the realm of the forms and ideas. But what we see in sense, like this tree or the flowers or the chairs, they are never real because senses could be cheating us. You remember I told you the story of the allegory of the cave. He gave an allegory of the cave to prove his idea of the theory of forms and idea. What is a form is something that exists in the mind, but also independent of the mind. That is what is real. Like the body and the soul. What we see as the body, what is tangible like the body, what can be seen by our senses and be touched and be felt is not real. What is real is what is seen, and it exists outside it exists in the body, and even it exists after a person dies, it exists outside the body. And that is the soul. That can be an analogy to explain the theory of forms and ideas. And the theory of forms and ideas were raised by a man by the name of Plato. And according to him, what we see is not real. Particular things are not real. There is one ideal real. I was telling you of the allegory of the caves. He said there were people who are tied in a cave, a dark cave, for the rest of their life. And people passed outside with chicken, walikuwa wanapita, and the people saw the shadows until they thought that the shadows were the real things. Later they discovered that the shadows were not real things. One of them fled and he saw the sun, he saw real things, and he came and told these people, but these people did not believe. They still believe that the shadow is real. It's like people who are trapped in the world of senses, in what you see. They cannot see the ideal world of the forms and ideas. That is the real world. And that is one philosopher called Plato. Plato had interesting ideas of three people. The people who exist by greed and by eating, those should be workers. There are people who are brave like soldiers, and the philosophers should be king. He had his own system in the republic of government. And that is Plato. Plato is one of the greatest influence, and his philosophy and that of Socrates and even of the pre-Socrates philosophers, their philosophy influences us even up to date. Now we look at a person by the name of Aristotle. Just as I told you, Plato was a student of Socrates, and he started a school that was called the Academy. It's one of the first institutions of higher learning. Aristotle also was a student of Plato. He was a polymath. He knew virtually everything except mathematics. Even during honeymoon, he collected species. And you will discover that according to Aristotle, the world of forms and the world of senses are one and the same thing. You cannot distinguish. And according to him, senses are important in discovering reality. I want to say that he had a very critical understanding of ethics. Ethics, the form of good. What is good? He had a very critical understanding of ethics. He developed arguments of the existence of God that Thomas Aquinas came and picked and utilized. Like God is the unmoved mover. God is the uncaused cause. The argument, the moral argument, those are arguments that Socrates, that Thomas Aquinas used, but originally they were formulated by a man by the name of Aristotle. Socrates, we look at Plato and Aristotle. Those were philosophers that epitomizes the Greek philosophy at its zenith. From there was a decline. Then there was the medieval period. Later, in the course of our study of philosophy, we shall look at three different schools of philosophy. The first school of philosophy is called rationalism. Rationalism was a school of philosophy that was propagated by a man by the name of Rene Descartes. Rene Descartes was a French philosopher. And his method of studying was to summon the greatest doubts. He doubted everything and he came to a logical conclusion. Ego, I think, therefore I am. It's called rationalism. According to him, senses, we are not certain. The only thing that we can be certain is on rationalism, what we think, and mathematical formulation of rationalism, knowledge without experience. And rationalism is a school that was propagated by a person by the name of Rene Descartes. So that is a school of philosophy that is called rationalism. From Rene Descartes, we go to another philosopher who epitomizes the German idealism. His name was Friedrich. He was called Friedrich Hegel. Hegel is a very difficult philosopher to understand. He's called an obscurist. An obscurist because his philosophy is very complex. And most of his writings you cannot understand. According to him, there is something that is called Geist. Geist is the spirit, but maybe he was talking about the Holy Spirit, the spirit that controls the affairs of history. And according to him, according to idealism, history moves in three phases. There is what we call the thesis, the antithesis, and the synthesis. And from the synthesis, you go back to a thesis. That is what we call dialectical thinking. The dialectical thinking is the thinking of idealism and is a very complex philosopher. In idealism is the brainchild of what we call Marxism. They look at history from that perspective. But there is this gaze that controls the affairs and the events of history. Lastly, we have what we call existentialism. This is a philosophy that was commenced by people when they saw man's condition, especially after the Renaissance or after the Enlightenment, and there was scientific, industrial growth, and the conditions of people who lived there was so deplorable, and life lost meaning. There was somebody who is called Soren Kierkegaard, for Fyodor Dostoevsky from Russia. Those are even William Shakespeare. They were the precursors. They were the precursors of existentialism. But after the the First and the Second World War, there was a lot of sense of hopelessness and despair. Life did not have meaning. Jean-Paul Sartre, one of the philosophers of existentialism, believed that life is an empty bubble out of the sea of nothing. Life is from nothing to nothing, and life is nothing. There is no purpose and form. Life is absurd. You find someone struggling, he studies in college, he marries, he studies in he studies in college, he gets a degree, he goes to RTS, he becomes an army, and he marries, and that month, even without getting a child, the man dies in Somalia in combat. It makes life to be meaningless. Life has despair. It has no sense, no purpose, no significance. Do you know why we live? When we look at it as existentialists, there is no purpose of existence. Life is an empty bubble out of the sea of nothing. There is what we call existentialism, the despair and the bleak of life. In fact, death adds to the despair of life. Man is alienated, and the existentialists do not believe in meta narratives and truth. According to them, you can only understand your own life. You cannot claim to have a standard for everybody. There is a lot of subjectivity and the denial of meta narratives in existentialism. It denies God's purpose on life, and it denies that we are unique, made in the image and the likeness of God. So it brings a lot of despair and hopelessness, and it does not answer the problems of life. In fact, it makes life become more difficult, more complex, and more complicated. So far, we have looked at what we call the three schools of philosophy. We have looked at rationalism, we have looked at idealism, and we have looked at existentialism. For the few remaining minutes, let's discuss about African philosophy. African philosophy is distinct from European philosophy and the Western philosophy. African philosophy is intensely practical. It does not deal with abstract issues of the origin of existence, but it deals with the real life issues. It expresses itself in terms of stories, myths, songs. It's a very practical theory. It's oral, not written. And people like Hegel say that Africa was not able to produce philosophy because it does not have a history of it does not have an history of philosophy, neither does it have a written language. Therefore, African is not capable of philosophy. But the truth of the matter is that Africans are philosophers. Why do I say African are philosophers? Because they are rational beings and they can think. Africans think concretely, not abstractly. They think on issues that are abstract. They use myths. It's an oral philosophy. It's not a written philosophy. And there are many schools of philosophy that we look at. There are four trends of African philosophy. The first trend of African philosophy is what we call ethno-philosophy. Ethno-philosophy is a philosophy that is based on an ethnic group, the collective wisdom of a community. That's what is called ethno-philosophy. It is one of the trends of African philosophy. The other one is philosophical sagacity. A sage is someone considered wise in the African community. It's a philosophy based on the reflection and the thinking of this wise person who is considered a sage. That is sagacity philosophy. Number three, we have a philosophy that is called nationalistic philosophy, generated by most of the political leaders during the clamor for independence, and it wanted to revamp the African hope and worldview. The last form of philosophy, trend of philosophy, is the written philosophy. It's professional. It's based on the West and the standard of philosophy. It's based on texts. That is written philosophy. Now, we look at some of these philosophies that we have in Africa. We have conscientism and Pan-Africanism by a person by the name of Kwame Nkrumah. Kwame Nkrumah was studied here in Ghana. Then he went to America and Britain, and he experienced a lot of discrimination as a black person. So he joined the student union, and later he joined the student union and joined with that other Pan-Africanism. And they started what we call, they started the Pan-African movement, and they championed the rights of the African, and he emphasized so much on the economy. And they say that when you get the economic kingdom, the rest of the things will follow us. There is somebody by the name of Leopold Sedar Senghor. He taught what we call negritude, the emphasis and the acceptance of black. And everything that is black is beautiful. I don't know why ladies these days paint their face to appear to be like a white person, because everything that was black was considered evil. Black sheep, black, anything black was jinxed and bad luck. So in negritude, we appreciate our worth as black, and affirm and talk positively about what is black. And it brought a lot of influence, especially in the fight against apartheid, and in the black conscientism in South Africa. It contributed a great deal. And in America, the black power and the black rights. That is so far what I can mention in a nutshell about this negritude by Leopold Sedar Senghor. We also look at these nationalistic philosophies, and we look at the philosophy of humanism of Kenneth Kaunda. The emphasis was man, and the desire for man to be involved in decision-making, democracy, and rules, and democracy and participation. Man must participate in development. And it emphasizes on hard work. It emphasizes on hard work. And the African spirit of hard work and brotherhood is the essence of humanism by Kenneth Kaunda of Zambia. By the way, he passed on just recently. Then later we have Mwalimu Julius Kabarage Nyerere with his Ujamaa philosophy. Ujamaa philosophy is about collectivization and brotherhood. It's about brotherhood and family. He wanted people to pool their resources together to build a better nation. In 1976, Kenyatta and Nyerere had alteration with words. And Kenyatta described Tanzania as a man-eat-nothing society, while Nyerere described Kenya as a man-eat-man society. We look at their philosophy: collectivization, hard work, villagization. People are placed in village and they were supposed to work hard. You'll find that despite the fact that it did not succeed, it made Tanzania to be a nation. But Kenya, there are different nations: the Kalenjin nation, the Kikuyu nation, the Luo nation, because while we improved in economy, but the nationhood was not built effectively. Later, we look at other philosophical trends from the African perspective. we look at Ubuntu philosophy. Ubuntu philosophy, I am because you are, and since you are, I am. It emphasizes the good for everyone. And Ubuntu philosophy was critical, especially during the COVID pandemic. We were able to support one another. And the bond and solidarity of brotherhood worldwide enables us to work together, have a great team, engage in teamwork. And we have Arambe philosophy. Arambe philosophy was started by the first president of Kenya, Mzee Jomo Kenyatta. Arambe philosophy from Kenyatta. The emphasis on Harambe philosophy from Kenyatta, the emphasis was pooling of resources to supplement the government effort. You pool resources, and when you pool resources, you supplement. There were two kinds. There was social development and economic development. Social development was like paying hospital bills. It was considered social development, which is still happening up to today. There was economic development like building of gabions, building of schools. They were called economic development. You'll find that Harambe was the call word for the Harambe philosophy, pulling together. And it helped. There are many schools and many hospitals that were built in the Harambe movement. But yet there was serious problem of corruption and misuse of Harambe for political expediency. There is Nyayo philosophy. Nyayo philosophy, Nyayo means following the footsteps. And it was commenced by the second president of Kenya, the late Mzee Daniel Toroitich Arap Moi. It was about pulling resources together. And the watchword was peace, love, and unity. And Mo used to have a walking baton or a rungu that was a symbol of Nyayoism. And Kenyatta used to have a fly whisk. Alikuwa na mkia. That was a symbol of the Harambe philosophy. Tuvute pamoja. It was the clarion call for the entire country. So we'll find Nyayo philosophy emphasizes being caring of other people's welfare. And Nyayo philosophy did a great of good to Kenya. But there was a problem of tribalism, nepotism, and even corruption. But it was one of the best philosophies. I think I have covered most of the philosophies, African philosophy in a nutshell. I want to look at two great philosophers who integrated both Christianity and African philosophy. Of course, Placide Temples is the father of African philosophy and a great theologian. The two great writers is somebody by the name of Kwame Bediako. Kwame Bediako. According to him, he thought that the context of the Romans in the 2nd century was the same with the context. They wanted to make Christianity feel at home in the Roman world. But in our situation, it is Christianity should be made to feel at home in the African culture and situation. And he talks about grassroots theology, theology that is expressed in African idiom. He picks an example of a mother by the name of Afia Gyan. And she uses African idiom and expression to express about God. Lastly, there is a Kenyan theologian by the name of Samuel John Mbiti, an Anglican from Makueni. He passed on 2022. A great scholar. And according to him, he applied the concepts of God in the concept of God in the African community. And he did a very intensive research, especially in 1968, as he was writing his thesis in Cambridge. And according to him, African theology is preparatio evangelii, supposed to prepare people to receive the gospel. And according to Mbiti wrote extensively, there are extensive books that you can read and use for African theology. But what is very critical is that Mbiti concept of time, that Africans have a short present, short future, a present, and a short past, a long future, a short present, and a short past. But is slightly taller than the African. Is slightly taller than the present. The present is very short. So he does this and he writes about it in his PhD thesis. So otherwise, I thank you for your concentration and participation.